Olivia Wells had been a detective for 6 years, and in that time, she'd learned that most corruption doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with a warning or a moment of clarity. It bleeds into the department like water through cracked concrete, spreading until you can't remember what solid ground looked like. That knowledge was precisely why she was standing in a Beco on the south side at 2 a.m, watching the address her informant had given her through binoculars that made everything look worse than it actually was. Her phone buzzed against her ribs. A text from her sister Rachel, still awake despite the hour, stopped by the apartment. "You left your coffee maker on again. How many times do I need to tell you that's a fire hazard?" Olivia didn't respond. Rachel had always been the responsible one, the organized one, the kind of person who remembered to turn off appliances and pay bills on time. Olivia was the cop who forgot to eat and worked cases that weren't technically assigned to her yet. Rachel was the only family she had left after their parents died 8 years ago, and that fact pressed against Olivia's chest like a weight whenever she thought about it too long. She forced her attention back to the warehouse across the street. Detective Sean Morrison was supposed to be here an hour ago. Sean, who she'd worked with for 3 years. Sean, who always brought coffee to the precinct and asked about her family. Sean, who apparently was deep enough in corruption to meet with handlers from the Ndrangheta in places like this. The information had taken her months to piece together, through accessing files she technically shouldn't have touched, cross-referencing transactions that didn't quite add up, following threads that led from Sean to Tenente David Price, to Captain James Richardson, a network that went deeper than just a few bad officers. A system. The first sign that something was wrong came when she heard the car doors opening across the street. Too many of them. The informant said Sean would arrive alone, or with maybe one contact. Instead, there were at least 4 bodies moving through the darkness with the kind of coordination that only came from planning. From coordination. Her hand moved instinctively to the weapon at her hip, though she knew that drawing it would only escalate whatever was about to happen. "Stay calm," she whispered to herself. "Document. Report. Let the system handle it." Except the system was part of what she was investigating. The shots came without warning. 3 rapid bursts, the sound swallowed by the Beco's narrow walls. Olivia's body reacted before her mind caught up. She was already moving, already crouching behind the dumpster that reeked of old oil and rotting food, already pulling her phone to call for backup when she realized the shots weren't aimed at the warehouse. They were aimed at the space between the warehouse and where she was standing. They were aimed at her. "Dispatch. This is Wells. I'm taking fire. South Side, Warehouse District. I need units." The phone fell from her hand as the bullet caught her shoulder, tearing through fabric and flesh with a sensation that was somehow both sharper and duller than she'd expected. Her backup weapon, the one she kept strapped to her thigh, felt very far away. Her body was already responding to shock, already shutting down the parts of her that weren't immediately necessary for survival. Another bullet caught her ribs. She felt that one distinctly, a bloom of heat that spread across her torso like spilled wine on a white shirt. The brick wall behind her was suddenly spattered with arterial spray, and Olivia realized with a strange detachment that some of it was probably hers. She tried to move, but her legs weren't cooperating. She tried to reach for her phone, but her hand was shaking too badly. Through the tunnel of her vision, she watched the figures across the street pause, then regroup. One of them said something in a language she didn't recognize. Italian, maybe, or something close to it. Then there was movement from somewhere else entirely. A different car, pulling up fast with the kind of aggressive engine sound that meant money and intent. The figures scattered like disturbed insects, melting back into their vehicle with a speed that suggested they'd been trained for extraction. Within seconds, they were gone, leaving only the smell of cordite and burning rubber. Olivia was alone again, bleeding into the cracked pavement of a Beco that nobody important ever visited. She was alone, and her phone was out of reach, and her vision was starting to gray at the edges, in a way that probably meant shock was setting in hard and fast. She'd read the statistics. People who bled out alone in alleys, people who didn't make it to hospital in time. She was thinking about Rachel's face when they told her that Olivia was dead when the car door opened beside her. A man's silhouette, backlit by streetlight, features obscured until he crouched down, and the light caught his face. Dark eyes that assessed her with the kind of calculated precision you didn't learn in any academy. A scar running from temple to jaw, thin and white and marking him as someone who'd survived violence before. Don't scream, he said quietly. Not a request, a statement of fact, delivered with the kind of certainty that made her believe he wasn't asking for permission, so much as informing her of what would happen if she didn't cooperate. She didn't scream. She was too busy noticing the badge tucked in the back of her waistband, the glint of her service weapon where it had fallen during the impact. This man saw those things too. He saw them, and something that might have been calculation flickered across his face. "You're police," he said. "Detective," Olivia managed, her voice small and strange in her own ears. "Olivia Wells, Chicago Police Department. You need to call an ambulance. You need to call—" "I know what needs to happen," he interrupted. He was already reaching for her, and every survival instinct Olivia had was screaming at her to fight, to move, to do something other than let this man touch her while she bled out onto the concrete. But her body wasn't listening to instinct anymore. Her body was listening to shock and blood loss, and the simple biological fact that she was no longer in control of what happened next. He moved with efficiency, wrapping something around her shoulder wound, applying pressure in a way that suggested he knew what he was doing. The pain of it cut through some of the fog, and Olivia gasped. "What's your name?" she asked, though she wasn't sure why she was asking, why she cared. "Someone who just saved your life," he said. He lifted her like she weighed nothing, carrying her toward the car. "You're coming with me, and you're going to stay very quiet about how you got there." She should have resisted. She should have fought. She should have done 100 things that didn't involve being loaded into the back seat of an expensive car that smelled like leather and cologne, and something else she couldn't quite place. Something that smelled like danger. The car accelerated into the Chicago night, and Olivia Wells, 6-year veteran of the force, only family to her sister Rachel, investigator of police corruption, disappeared into the city that never quite slept, but was very good at forgetting. Consciousness came in fragments, a hand pressing cool water to her lips. The smell of antiseptic and something floral that didn't belong in a hospital. Machines that weren't beeping the way hospital machines should beep. Olivia's eyelids felt weighted, her entire body heavy in a way that suggested either sedation or significant blood loss, possibly both. She tried to speak, and managed only a rasping sound that hurt her ribs. "Don't," a voice said from somewhere near the window. Not the voice from the alley. This was a woman's voice, older, carrying an accent that made the words sound like a command carved from stone. "Moving too much will damage the sutures." Olivia forced her eyes open. The room materialized slowly, expensive furnishings becoming clear. Not a hospital. Definitely not a hospital. The ceiling was coffered wood. The windows overlooked grounds that were too manicured, too controlled. She was lying in a bed that probably cost more than her monthly rent, dressed in clothing that wasn't hers, with an IV in her arm delivering fluids she hadn't consented to. "Where am I?" Her voice cracked on the last word. The woman who'd spoken didn't answer immediately. She was older, perhaps in her 60s, with silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in a style that suggested European sensibilities. Her expression offered nothing. "You're safe," she said finally. "That's what matters." It wasn't an answer. Olivia tried to sit up, and immediately regretted it. The pain in her shoulder was a living thing, radiating down her arm in waves. Her ribs protested equally. She fell back against the pillows, breathing carefully through her nose. "How long?" she managed. 4 weeks, a different voice answered. The man from the alley stood in the doorway, and in full light, he was almost worse than he'd been in shadow. The scar on his face was clearer now, more defined. His eyes were that unsettling dark brown that seemed to catalog everything they looked at. He wore a shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms that suggested regular violence of some kind. "You coded twice. My doctor wasn't sure you'd make it." "Your doctor?" Olivia's throat was dry. "Where the hell am I?" "North Shore," he said simply, moving further into the room. "About 40 minutes from where you were shot. And before you ask, no, I'm not taking you to a hospital. Not yet. Maybe not at all." The implications of that statement hung in the air between them. Olivia forced herself to breathe slowly, to think through the fog of medication and pain. She was with the man who'd shot her, except he'd also saved her. The contradiction was making her head hurt worse than the actual physical injuries. "My sister," Olivia said. The words came out more desperate than she'd intended. "Rachel. I need to contact my sister. She'll be looking for me." The woman who'd been speaking before nodded at the man, then left the room with the kind of silence that suggested practice in discretion. The man pulled a chair closer to the bed, a piece of furniture that looked antique and probably was. He sat with the kind of posture that suggested someone trained in violence, spine straight, shoulders relaxed, positioned where he could see the entire room and the doorway simultaneously. "Your sister knows you're missing," he said. "The police have been informed. There's an investigation. Nothing has been found. I need to call her." Olivia tried again to sit up, managed it this time by gritting her teeth through the pain. "She needs to know I'm alive. If you call her, she dies." "The threat profile on you changed the minute they missed the kill," he added, voice flat. "Any trace leads back to your family first. Law enforcement knows that pattern as well as I do." The statement was delivered with such casual certainty that for a moment, Olivia wasn't sure she'd heard it correctly. She stared at this man, this stranger, this criminal who'd pulled her bleeding body from a Chicago alley, and tried to understand the mathematics of what he'd just said. "That's not," she started. "The people who shot you weren't random," he continued. "They weren't muggers or gang members settling territorial disputes. They were specific. They knew where you'd be. They knew when you'd be there. And they knew exactly how to make it look like you'd simply disappeared." He leaned back in the chair, and it creaked slightly under his weight. "If your sister suddenly receives a call from a phone she hasn't heard from in weeks, and then that phone goes silent, what do you think happens?" Olivia's mouth was dry again. She understood. Of course she understood. The people who wanted her dead would use Rachel as leverage, would use Rachel as a way to finish what they'd started in that alley. "How do you know all this?" she whispered. "Because I know who tried to kill you," he said, "and I know why." He stood and moved to a desk that Olivia hadn't noticed before, pulling out a tablet that glowed in the afternoon light. When he returned, he showed her the screen. Bank transfers, communications intercepted. Names and dates and amounts that added up to something so large and so systematic that it couldn't be anything but organized corruption. Detective Sean Morrison, Tenente David Price, Captain James Richardson, her people, her colleagues, her friends. "These are active transfers," the man said, pointing to dates that coincided with operations Olivia had worked. "Payments for specific services, corridor access, early warnings about raids, blind eyes turned to certain shipments coming through the docks." He let that sink in, then continued. "Your investigation threatened them. Not slowly, immediately. And they decided the simplest solution was to eliminate the threat." "Who are you?" Olivia's voice was hollow now, hollowed out by the realization that the institution she'd served had turned against her with such precision. "Someone who shares an interest in your survival," he said simply. "At least for now. That's not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It's not." He stood and walked toward the window, leaving Olivia alone with the tablet and the terrible knowledge that everything she'd believed about her career, her colleagues, and her place in the world had been fundamentally wrong. Outside, the grounds were pristine, manicured, controlled. A place where people didn't simply disappear because it wasn't convenient for them to exist. A place where she had become a ghost. 3 hours later, a phone was placed in her hand. An old model, burner grade, the kind that could be discarded. The man, who still hadn't offered his name, explained the terms with the precision of someone used to negotiations. "One call," he said. "You tell your sister you're alive. You tell her you're safe. You don't tell her where you are. You don't give her any information that could be traced. And then we never have this conversation again." Olivia's hands shook as she dialed the number. It rang 4 times before Rachel answered, her voice thick with something that might have been sleep or might have been crying. "Hello? Rachel." Olivia's voice broke on the single syllable of her sister's name. The silence that followed was absolute. Then, "Olivia? Oh my God, Olivia, where are you? The police said, everyone said you were—" "I'm alive," Olivia said quickly, aware of the man watching her from across the room. "I'm safe. I can't explain right now, but I need you to listen to me very carefully." Yes, I'm listening. I'm here. Where are you? I'm coming to get you." You can't," Olivia said, and it was the hardest sentence she'd ever spoken. "Rachel, you need to listen. I can't contact you again. Not yet. Maybe not for a long time." And if you try to find me, if you try to tell anyone that I've called, it puts you in danger. Real danger. Liv, that's insane. That's crazy talk. You need to come home. You need to tell the police. The police are part of the problem, Olivia said. She watched the man's expression shift slightly, something that might have been approval flickering across his face. Just trust me, Rachel. Trust that I'm doing what I have to do. Trust that I'm alive and I'm going to stay that way. But you have to let me go. Rachel was crying now, the sound of it cutting through the phone line like razors. Olivia wanted to say more, wanted to explain everything, wanted to apologize for being the kind of cop who investigated the wrong people and got herself shot in an alley. But the man was already reaching for the phone, already indicating that time was up. I love you, Olivia said. I'm sorry. I love you. The line went dead. The man powered off the phone and removed the SIM card, then burned it in a small dish on the desk while Olivia watched. When it was finished, he placed the phone in a bag with other items that looked equally disposable. Your sister will receive a news report about a traffic accident, he said, his voice deliberately neutral. A Jane Doe victim. The authorities will close the file. She'll have closure. It's the best option available. Olivia realized what he was saying. Her parents had died in a car accident. Rachel had already buried that particular grief. Now, she was going to have to bury it again. Who are you? Olivia asked again. But the man was already leaving, and she understood that some answers weren't coming today. The room was quiet after he left. Through the window, she could see the grounds outside, perfectly maintained and utterly isolated. She was alive, but she was also gone. As far as everyone who knew her was concerned, Olivia Wells had ceased to exist. The woman lying in this expensive bed in this impossible house was something else entirely, something new, something that didn't have a name yet, but would need to find one quickly, if she had any hope of surviving what was coming. Recovery happened in stages that had nothing to do with linear time. One day, Olivia could barely lift her arm without white-hot pain spreading across her torso. The next day, the pain was still there, but she could move further. By the end of the second month, she was walking the perimeter of Franco's study without using the walls for support. By the end of the fourth month, she could almost forget that bullets had ever pierced her body at all. The man, Franco Ravellini, as she'd eventually learned his name, moved through the mansion with the kind of deliberate purpose that suggested he owned not just the building, but the very air inside it. He appeared at irregular intervals, always when Olivia was least expecting him. A woman who worked for him, someone named Rosa, who was older and European and spoke very little, brought meals on trays and changed bandages with clinical precision. But Franco was the one who monitored recovery, who asked questions about pain levels and mobility, who arranged for a physical therapist to visit 3 times weekly. It was during one of these sessions, with Franco observing from a leather chair near the window, that he finally made his proposal. I need information, he said, not bothering with preamble. The therapist had left an hour earlier, and Olivia was seated on the edge of the bed, rotating her shoulder through a series of movements that still hurt, but hurt differently than they had before. Information about what? Olivia knew better than to play naive, but she also wasn't going to make assumptions about what he wanted. Police infrastructure, systems, how access is granted and denied, which protocols are actively monitored and which ones are older, more vulnerable. He leaned back in the chair, and the leather creaked beneath his weight. Protocol changes, personnel rotations, which officers have access to what databases and why. Olivia stopped rotating her shoulder. You're asking me to compromise police systems. I'm asking you to explain how police systems work, he corrected. I have people who can do the technical work. What I need is context. The way a police officer thinks about security, where vulnerabilities exist because of procedure rather than technology. No. The word came out faster than she'd intended. I'm not going to help you infiltrate anything. Franco didn't react to the refusal the way she'd expected. He didn't threaten. He didn't pressure. He simply stood and walked to the desk, retrieving a folder that had been sitting there all along. When he opened it in front of her, photographs spilled out. Bank statements, intercepts of communications, names and dates and transaction histories that spelled out, in unmistakable detail, the systematic corruption that had nearly gotten her killed. Detective Sean Morrison, Franco said, pointing to one of the photographs. $3,000 monthly deposit to an account in his wife's name. Tenente David Price. Similar pattern but larger amounts. Captain James Richardson. He looked at her. You knew these men. I worked with them, Olivia said quietly. You worked for them, Franco corrected. They saw you investigating something that threatened their operations. So they attempted to eliminate you. My question is, do you still consider that institution worth protecting? Olivia stared at the evidence on the bed. Every instinct told her this was a trap, that accepting the deal would make her complicit in something larger and darker than she could comprehend. But every rational part of her understood that the institution she'd served had already betrayed her, had already decided she was worth killing. What exactly would this work involve? She asked. Franco explained the parameters carefully. She wouldn't access any systems directly. She wouldn't perform any technical breach of security. She would simply provide contextual information. Which passwords remained active across rotation cycles? Which officers had access that they shouldn't technically have? Which protocols had been updated in the last year, and which ones remained from older administrations? How the department thought about compartmentalization and information control. For how long? She asked. 6 months, he said. You provide information. You help me understand the landscape. At the end of that time, you'll have options. Location abroad if you want it. Testimony if you prefer that route. Security in exchange for continued cooperation. And if I refuse? Then you stay in this house until I decide what to do with you, he said. And there was no malice in his voice, which somehow made it worse. But you don't strike me as someone who refuses when presented with actual alternatives. He was right. Olivia hated that he was right. She had no life outside this house, no career to return to, no way to contact Rachel except through the mediated channels Franco had already established. She was trapped. And the only person offering her even the illusion of agency was the man whose organization had originally orchestrated her shooting. Okay, she said finally. 6 months. Franco established her workspace in a separate section of the mansion, an office that was isolated both physically and technologically, a laptop that was encrypted beyond her technical understanding, access to documents but not devices, a system designed so that she could provide information without being able to steal, copy, or transmit anything except what Franco explicitly approved. Over the first 2 weeks of the arrangement, Olivia began to understand the true sophistication of Franco's operation. He had analysts, people with degrees from places like MIT and Stanford, forensic accountants who could trace money through 7 different jurisdictions and emerge with a picture of exactly where it had come from and where it was going, specialists in cybersecurity who could explain vulnerabilities in systems Olivia had thought were impenetrable. But what surprised her more was the consistency of Franco's own code. He refused certain types of work. She overheard a conversation where someone presented a proposal involving trafficking, and Franco shut it down with a single word. No. Another discussion about an operation that would have involved collateral civilian casualties, and Franco's response was immediate and final. Find another approach. He was a criminal, yes. But he was a criminal with limitations, with rules. And somehow that made him more complex and more frightening than if he'd been simple malevolence in a tailored suit. By the 3rd month, Franco began letting her write letters to Rachel. They were screened, monitored, sent through intermediaries that made them impossible to trace. Rachel's responses came back through the same channels, printed out and delivered to Olivia by Rosa without comment. I'm not happy about this arrangement, Rachel had written, but I'm grateful you're alive. Please be careful. Please come home as soon as you can. Olivia wanted to respond that home no longer existed, that the woman she'd been, the detective who'd believed in justice and institutions, had died in that alley. But she couldn't explain that in a monitored letter, so instead she wrote, I love you. I'm safe. Trust me. It was during one of her evening walks through Franco's study, ostensibly looking for a book to read, that she found him standing at the window. He was staring out at the grounds, which were illuminated by subtle lighting that probably cost thousands of dollars to install. He looked tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. The work you're doing, he said, without turning around. It's accelerating some timelines. I've been able to identify vulnerabilities I didn't know existed. Is that good? She asked. It's efficient, he said. There's a difference. Olivia stood near him, close enough to see the scar on his face more clearly. It was older than she'd realized, puckered slightly where it had healed. A reminder of violence survived. "Why do you do this?" she asked. "The criminal enterprise, the control, all of it?" Franco turned to look at her, and for a moment his expression was completely open. Vulnerable in a way that seemed impossible for someone like him. "Because I never had a choice," he said. "I was born into this, raised in this, and by the time I understood what it was, I was already too entangled to leave." He turned back to the window. "You, on the other hand, chose to be a police officer. You chose an institution, and then that institution tried to kill you. So now you have a choice I never had. You can build something different, if you're willing to do what it takes." Olivia realized, standing beside him in that study with the city lights spread out before them, that her understanding of Franco had shifted. She didn't trust him, not yet, but she was beginning to see him not as a monster, but as a man trapped in a system he'd inherited, operating according to rules he'd learned young and learned well. The thought terrified her more than any explicit threat ever could. 2 more months passed in this strange arrangement. Franco and Olivia found themselves having conversations that had nothing to do with police infrastructure or criminal operations. They talked about music she'd grown up with and music he preferred. They discussed books she'd read and books he recommended. There were moments where Olivia almost forgot that she was essentially imprisoned, that her freedom existed only at Franco's discretion. One evening, as Rosa was serving dinner, Franco mentioned that he'd arranged another letter exchange with Rachel. He did this sometimes, Olivia had learned, established contact, verified it was genuine, then allowed the correspondence to proceed. "Your sister is struggling," he said. There was no judgment in his tone, only observation. The police held a memorial service. She attended. She's trying to move forward, but it's difficult for her. Olivia felt something crack inside her chest at the image of Rachel attending a funeral for someone who wasn't actually dead, standing at a gravesite that held nothing, mourning a sister who was alive and breathing and sitting in a criminal's mansion on the North Shore. "Can I write to her?" Olivia asked. "You can," Franco said, "but understand that every letter puts her at risk. If someone traces that correspondence, if anyone realizes you're alive, she becomes leverage." "I understand," Olivia said, and she did. She understood that love was a liability now, that caring about Rachel was dangerous for Rachel, that perhaps the kindest thing she could do was to let her sister believe she was dead and move forward accordingly. But she couldn't do that. She couldn't simply abandon her sister to that grief. So, she wrote a letter, a careful, coded letter that said nothing explicit but conveyed everything important, that she was alive, that she was safe, that she loved Rachel, and that Rachel needed to stop looking for her because continuing to search would only bring harm. "This is wise," Franco said, reading the letter before it was sent. "You're protecting her by being honest about the situation." "I'm abandoning her," Olivia said bitterly. "No," Franco said. "You're recognizing that some situations don't have good solutions, only varying degrees of acceptable loss." Olivia wanted to hate him for saying it so plainly, but she couldn't, because he was right. And the fact that he was right, that she was beginning to see the logic in his worldview, was perhaps the most terrifying development of all. By the middle of June, Franco's operation had evolved into something resembling a corporate intelligence agency. The difference was that most corporations didn't have former NSA analysts sitting in converted libraries, running pattern recognition on police databases. By July, Olivia had stopped being surprised by the caliber of people Franco employed. By August, she was actively impressed by how systematically they dismantled institutional safeguards that she'd always assumed were impenetrable. Her role became increasingly defined as she spent hours in the isolated office, explaining not just what police systems did, but how police officers thought about those systems, which protocols had been in place long enough that nobody really questioned them anymore, which access points seemed to get audited more rigorously than others, which supervisory structures created natural bottlenecks that people routinely worked around because it was faster than following proper channels. "You're essentially mapping institutional laziness," Franco observed one afternoon, standing in the doorway of her workspace. He had a habit of appearing without warning, moving through the mansion with the kind of deliberate quietness that suggested military training or something close to it. "I'm explaining how real organizations actually function versus how they're supposed to function," Olivia corrected. But she understood what he meant. Every system had cracks. Every institution had workarounds that eventually became tradition. The difference between policy and practice. Franco nodded, considering this. That's more valuable than most people realize. By late August, the hackers working for Franco had penetrated far enough into the police infrastructure to access financial records that mapped out the corruption in precise detail. Sean Morrison received $3,000 monthly, deposited into an account under his wife's name. David Price's payments were larger, sometimes reaching $7,000 in months when there was active interference with investigations. James Richardson orchestrated the whole operation, receiving direct transfers that disappeared into cryptocurrency exchanges and shell accounts before surfacing in legitimate banking institutions. It was elegant in its own way, systematic, practiced, the kind of corruption that only worked because it was distributed across enough people that no single person was conspicuous. Olivia was reviewing a particular set of transfers when Franco burst into the office. Actually, burst, which was unusual for him. His expression was controlled, but there was a tension around his eyes that she'd learned to recognize as something approaching concern. "We have a problem," he said without preamble. "The Ndrangheta has begun to notice irregularities. Specific attention patterns they shouldn't have noticed." "What kind of patterns?" Olivia's stomach tightened. "The kind that suggests someone is investigating their infrastructure specifically. They're moving cautiously, but they're moving. And Sean Morrison has become suspicious about why his routine contacts have stopped responding to messages in predictable ways. Did someone compromise?" "No," Franco said firmly. "My people are careful. But the Ndrangheta maintains its own surveillance apparatus, and they've flagged that something in the status quo has shifted. When they flag something, their subordinates begin asking questions. Sean Morrison is asking those questions to Captain Richardson right now." Olivia stood, pacing the small office. "What does Richardson do?" "Panics," Franco said simply. "He's already nervous, because Price has been unreachable for 2 weeks due to a family emergency. When Richardson panics, he makes decisions that a rational person wouldn't make." Over the next 72 hours, Olivia learned just how accurate Franco's prediction had been. Richardson hired a private investigator, which seemed like a logical move to someone whose criminal enterprise was beginning to fracture. The investigator was mediocre, which was worse than if he'd been genuinely skilled. He approached Franco's property with the kind of obvious surveillance that suggested he'd learned everything he knew from television shows. Franco's security team detected him within an hour. Franco, however, made a decision that surprised Olivia. Instead of removing the problem immediately, he had the investigator monitored, allowed him to continue his surveillance, allowed him to photograph Franco's staff, take notes, establish patterns. "Why would you do that?" she asked when Franco explained the situation. "Because whoever hired him will reach out eventually," Franco said. "And when they do, my people will intercept that communication. We'll know exactly how worried Richardson is, and who he's told." It took a week. 7 days of the investigator conducting increasingly sloppy surveillance from different vantage points around the property. Then contact came from Richardson's personal phone to the investigator's burner line. Franco's people had the communication intercepted before the investigator even understood it was happening. The conversation was brief. Richardson was asking for confirmation that Franco Ravellini was conducting his own investigation into police operations. He was offering money. He was expressing, in carefully coded language, a willingness to negotiate. Franco listened to the recording with a kind of expression that suggested he was calculating probabilities and outcomes that were invisible to Olivia. Richardson's loyalty to the Ndrangheta is secondary to his loyalty to himself, Franco explained, leaning back in his chair. The leather creaked beneath his weight. When he realizes the investigation is converging, he'll flip. The question is whether he flips before or after they execute him for his failures. "What happens to the investigator?" Olivia asked. "He disappears," Franco said. "Not permanently. He's paid a significant sum of money and relocated out of state under a new identity. The officially reported narrative, when anyone notices his absence, is that he died in a car accident in Iowa. Paperwork does the rest. He disappears," Franco said. "Not permanently. He's paid a significant sum of money and relocated. Mexico has a climate he'll find agreeable, and the exchange rate makes his new life very comfortable. The officially reported narrative, when anyone notices his absence, is that he was in a traffic accident. Chicago is dangerous for investigators. You're just going to let him live? After he was investigating your property? He was hired to do a job, Franco said. He did his job. There's no percentage in killing him. Dead men attract attention. Men living comfortably in another country attract nothing at all. It was pragmatic in a way that made Olivia's head hurt. Franco operated according to logic that was perfectly consistent within his own framework, but utterly alien to the way she'd been trained to think. By early September, Franco convoked her again. This time, the atmosphere was different, more urgent. He brought her to his private study, the room where she'd first seen physical evidence of police corruption months earlier. The situation is reaching critical stage, he said without preamble. In approximately 10 days, the Ndrangheta will become aware that one of their senior people has been cooperating with federal agents for the past 6 months. They will respond violently. When they do, they will target not just the cooperator, but anyone associated with investigations that threaten their operations. That's you, Olivia said slowly. Yes, Franco confirmed. And therefore indirectly, that's you. He outlined the situation with brutal clarity. Multiple investigations were converging on the police corruption network. The Ndrangheta was destabilizing. Federal agencies were beginning to move. The situation that had been manageable 3 months ago was becoming exponentially more dangerous. I'm offering you 3 options, Franco said. His voice was steady, but there was something underneath it that Olivia had learned to recognize as genuine concern. First, I move you to a secure location outside the country. You disappear completely. New identity, new life, no contact with anyone you've ever known. You're safe that way, but you're also gone. Second option? She asked, though part of her already knew. You go to the FBI, he said. You provide testimony about what you've discovered. You enter the Federal Witness Protection Program. You'll eventually be able to have limited contact with your sister. You'll have legal standing to rebuild some form of life, but you'll be forever entangled with the system that tried to kill you. And the third? Franco stood and walked to the window, looking out at the grounds that were beginning to transition from summer to autumn. We continue as we are. I protect you. You provide information. We navigate whatever comes next together. But understand that this option is the most dangerous. For both of us. Olivia felt the weight of the decision settling on her shoulders. Every option represented a different death of sorts. The death of her freedom, the death of her past, or the death of her safety. I need to think about this, she said finally. You have 48 hours, Franco replied. After that, the decision becomes made for us by external circumstances, and those decisions are rarely the ones we would have chosen for ourselves. He turned to look at her, and for the first time, Olivia saw something in his expression that went beyond calculation or strategy. Vulnerability, maybe. Or something that was trying very hard to look like concern, but was afraid of being rejected if it revealed itself too openly. Whatever you decide, Franco said quietly, know that your safety is the priority, even if it compromises your operation? Olivia asked. Especially then, he said, and she believed him. Olivia stood on the balcony that overlooked Franco's grounds, watching the autumn light turn the manicured landscaping into something almost unreal. It was 3 a.m, and she hadn't slept in 36 hours. The deadline Franco had given her was approaching like a storm system on a weather map. Inevitable and impossible to outrun. She heard him before she saw him. Franco had a way of moving through the mansion that was almost supernatural in its quietness. The result of decades spent in environments where being heard first meant being dead first. He joined her at the railing without speaking, standing close enough that she could smell the cedar cologne he wore, expensive and understated. You haven't decided, he said. It wasn't a question. I've decided, Olivia replied. I just haven't told you yet. Franco was silent for a long moment. The night air was cool, carrying the first real hints of approaching winter. Somewhere in the distance, a car horn sounded, a reminder that the world beyond these grounds continued to function regardless of what happened here. I could make the choice for you, Franco said finally. Move you somewhere you'd be safe. Argentina, maybe. Or somewhere in Eastern Europe where records don't connect to who you were before. You could, Olivia agreed, but you won't. No, he said quietly. I won't. They stood in silence for a while longer. Olivia had learned, over the past months, that Franco was comfortable with quiet in a way most people weren't. He didn't feel compelled to fill spaces with sound or justification. He just existed, present and controlled, waiting. When I was younger, Franco said eventually, I had a choice. One night, my father gave me an opportunity to leave, to walk away from all of this and become someone else, someone normal. He paused, watching the grounds. I didn't take it. I told myself I couldn't abandon the family business, that I had responsibilities, that walking away would be seen as weakness. What was the real reason? Olivia asked. Fear, Franco said simply. I was terrified of being nobody, of being ordinary. The life my father offered me, the violence, the control, the power. At least it was something. It was identity. He turned to look at her. You're not afraid of being nobody, Olivia. You're afraid of continuing to be complicit in something broken. Olivia felt tears threaten and fought them back. I have to testify. I know, Franco said. I've known for 2 days. The moment you started asking questions about witness protection protocols, I understood. How are you so... She started, then stopped. Accepting? Resigned? Because I love you, Franco said, and the words were delivered with the same clinical precision he used for everything else. Not in the way movies describe love, not in the way that demands you stay and build something impossible with me. I love you in the way that means I want you to survive this, regardless of what it costs me. Olivia turned to face him fully. In the darkness, his scar was barely visible, just a thin line running from temple to jaw. A mark of violence survived, of choices made and consequences accepted. Come with me, she said. The words escaped before she could stop them. Come with me and testify. You have leverage. You have evidence. You could be imprisoned for 40 years? Franco smiled, but there was no humor in it. No, Bella. I'm not the one who can walk away. I'm too deep. I've done too many things. The best I can hope for is to continue as I am, operating in the spaces between the law and chaos. But you still have a chance at something resembling normal. This isn't normal, Olivia said. None of this is normal. No, Franco agreed. But it's better than being dead in a Chicago alley, which is where you would be if I hadn't found you. Over the next 2 days, Franco made arrangements with precision and speed that suggested this wasn't the first time he'd facilitated someone's transition into federal custody. He had contacts within the FBI, not corrupted agents, he explained, but pragmatists who understood that sometimes information was valuable enough to negotiate around traditional channels. On the morning of the 3rd day, Olivia sat in Franco's study one final time. She'd packed a single bag with items Franco deemed safe for transport. Clothes. A photograph of Rachel that Franco had somehow obtained without her knowledge. A copy of one of Rachel's letters. The FBI will move you today, Franco said. Agent Torres is handling the operation personally. She's trustworthy. As much as anyone in that organization can be. What will you do? Olivia asked. Continue, Franco said simply. I'll continue to exist in the spaces I've carved out. I'll manage my operations. I'll ensure the 'Ndrangheta doesn't expand unchecked in this city. I'll survive, as I always have. He paused. And I'll wait to hear that you're safe. You can't... Olivia started. I won't contact you, Franco finished. I understand the parameters. You'll be under federal protection, in a new identity, in a place where your connection to me could compromise your safety. I won't jeopardize that, but I'll know. Through channels that are careful and invisible, I'll know that you're alive and building something better than this. The black SUVs arrived at noon. FBI agents who were polite but professional, who didn't ask questions about Franco or his property or how Olivia had been living for the past months. Torres herself was driving one of them, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and an expression that suggested she'd seen enough corruption to be unsurprised by anything. Olivia said goodbye to Franco in the entrance hall. Rosa was there, watching with the kind of expression that suggested she understood more than she let on. Franco looked like he always did. Controlled, composed, utterly present. Goodbye, Olivia said. Not goodbye, Franco corrected. Never goodbye. Just, for now. The drive to the safe house took 6 hours. During that time, Olivia received news that Ricardo, the private investigator, had been found in Iowa in a car accident. Tragic, Torres explained. Terrible luck. Olivia understood the message Franco was sending. Loose ends were being tied up. Witnesses to her disappearance were being managed. He was clearing the board to protect her testimony. That night, from an anonymous phone in a safe house that was indistinguishable from 1,000 other safe houses, Olivia was permitted a single call. Rachel answered on the second ring, like she'd been waiting. "Olivia?" Her voice broke on the name. "It's me," Olivia said. "I'm alive. I'm safe, but I can't come home yet. I can't explain everything, but I need you to understand that I didn't disappear because I wanted to. I disappeared because staying would have destroyed both of us." Rachel was crying now. "Where are you?" "I can't tell you. Not yet. Possibly not for a very long time, but I'm going to testify about what happened to me, about why I disappeared, and then I'm going to start over somewhere else as someone else." "What about—" Rachel started, then stopped. "Is he the reason? The man who took you? He saved my life," Olivia said carefully. "And now I'm going to save myself. That's all you need to know." The line went quiet, except for the sound of Rachel breathing. Olivia imagined her sister in their shared apartment, the one Olivia would never return to, surrounded by memories of the life she'd lived before. "I love you," Olivia said. "I'm going to always love you. And I'm going to be okay." "You better be," Rachel whispered, "because I just got my sister back. I'm not losing you again." When the call ended, Olivia sat in the darkness of the safe house and let herself grieve. Not for what she'd lost. She was beginning to understand that she'd lost those things the moment Sean Morrison decided to work with the Ndrangheta. She grieved for what she was leaving behind. For Franco, operating in his mansion on the North Shore, knowing she was gone, and that this was the price of her survival. For Rachel, building a life that now had to accommodate a sister who might never fully return. For the version of herself that had believed the institution she served would protect her. But she also understood something that she hadn't before. Sometimes survival meant becoming someone new. Sometimes the only way to live was to let the person you were die and accept the person you were becoming. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, you found someone in the wreckage who understood that and let you go anyway. The federal building was colder than any room Olivia had encountered in Franco's mansion. Clinical. Designed to strip away personality and replace it with institutional procedure. She sat in a conference room with Agent Torres and an assistant United States attorney named Elena Navarro, no relation to Detective Sean Morrison, a woman in her early 40s with the kind of neutral expression that suggested she'd heard every terrible story in existence and remained unmoved. "Walk me through the evening of the incident," Navarro said, her pen poised above a legal pad. They'd done this before, 3 times now, but each repetition was designed to find inconsistencies, to test whether Olivia's story held together under pressure. Olivia recounted the details methodically. The surveillance on Sean Morrison, the warehouse on the south side, the gunshots, the man who appeared with a scar on his face and dark eyes that assessed situations like chess problems. She omitted nothing except the name Franco Ravellini. When pressed, she simply said, "My rescuer's identity is complicated, but he's provided documentation that corroborates my account." Morrison made notes. Torres, who sat beside Olivia, said nothing. They'd developed an understanding over the weeks of preparation. Torres believed her. That was enough. The grand jury hearing occurred on a Tuesday in October, 8 weeks after Olivia had left Franco's mansion. She testified for 4 hours, describing the investigation she'd been conducting, the names she'd discovered, the systematic corruption within the Chicago Police Department. The jurors listened with the kind of focused attention reserved for stories that shattered assumptions about institutions people trusted. Sean Morrison was indicted on October 18th. David Price on October 22nd. James Richardson on November 1st. Each indictment was more damaging than the last, revealing not isolated corruption, but a network of officers who'd systematized their betrayal into something resembling a business operation. The media descended on Chicago like vultures, recognizing fresh carrion. News vans camped outside police headquarters. Reporters shouted questions that nobody was authorized to answer. The narrative that emerged was compelling. A young female detective had discovered corruption reaching into the highest levels of her department, had been attacked because of her investigation, and had emerged to testify against her own colleagues. Internally, prosecutors were careful to note that Assistant U.S. Attorney Elena Navarro bore no connection to Detective Sean Morrison. What the media didn't know was that the primary evidence came from a criminal organization's analysis of police infrastructure. They didn't know that a mafia boss on the North Shore had orchestrated the entire revelation. That absence of knowledge was deliberate, protected by federal agreements that Olivia suspected would never be made public. Rachel received visitors from the Chicago Tribune in early November. Journalists wanting to speak with the sister of the missing detective, who'd turned out to be alive. Rachel, who'd spent months in genuine mourning, answered their questions carefully. Yes, she was relieved her sister was alive. No, she couldn't discuss specific details. Yes, she was proud of Olivia's courage. The photograph that emerged from one of those interviews showed Rachel standing in her studio, surrounded by half-finished restoration projects. She looked smaller than Olivia remembered, diminished by the weight of believing someone dead, and then discovering they'd simply disappeared into a different kind of grave. When Olivia called her that night, Rachel didn't ask where she was or what was happening. She simply said, "I'm proud of you. I hate this, but I'm proud." The trials began in January and stretched into May. 8 months of testimony, evidence presentation, and legal maneuvering. Olivia appeared in the courtroom 3 times, her testimony forming the foundational narrative of how the corruption had been discovered. She sat in the witness box while defense attorneys attempted to undermine her credibility, attacked her methodology, suggested her investigation was personal rather than professional. She held steady. She'd been trained to withstand interrogation. What she hadn't been trained for was watching people she'd known for years be convicted on her testimony. Sean Morrison received 8 years. David Price received 10. James Richardson received 12, the longest sentence because he'd orchestrated the entire operation, and, more significantly, because evidence suggested he'd personally ordered her death. When the gavel came down on Richardson's sentencing, Olivia felt something that wasn't satisfaction and wasn't relief. It was the strange emptiness that followed when violence stopped, but nothing healed. Agent Torres met her afterward in a quiet office. "The department is in chaos," Torres said. "There's an interim leadership team. Reform measures are being implemented. It's not perfect, but it's movement." "And Franco Ravellini?" Olivia asked, though she knew the answer. "Remains under investigation," Torres said carefully. "But without direct testimony against him, prosecution becomes complicated. The evidence you provided about police corruption doesn't directly implicate him in criminal activity. It simply shows he has information about that corruption." Olivia understood. Franco had orchestrated everything with enough distance that plausible deniability remained intact. He was a ghost, haunting the institutions that tried to regulate him, visible only through the effects he created. The Witness Protection Program relocated her to Colorado Springs on a Tuesday in June. New name, new social security number, new history. Sarah Mitchell, who'd worked in data analysis for technology companies and had no family connections in Chicago. The cover story was simple enough to verify but boring enough that nobody would look deeper. Her first apartment was small and anonymous. She bought furniture that was functional rather than beautiful. She established a routine. Work during the day at a cybersecurity firm that specializing in corporate data protection, walks in the evening, carefully monitored communication with Rachel through federal channels. 3 months into her new life, Olivia intercepted a message during her workday. It was encrypted beyond standard protocols, routed through channels that suggested someone familiar with federal surveillance techniques. The message was brief. "You're safe. That's all that matters. F." She didn't respond. She couldn't respond. But she kept the message in a secure file that existed nowhere except in her memory. A reminder that even in absolute isolation, she wasn't completely alone. The call came through encrypted channels that the FBI's technical liaison had deemed acceptable for monitored conversation. It was June, exactly 1 year after Olivia had testified against James Richardson, and the timing felt deliberately orchestrated. Torres had arranged it, explained it as necessary psychological closure for a witness, whose life had been fractured into before and after. The phone in her hand felt foreign despite months of holding it. Her new apartment in Colorado Springs was silent except for the sound of her own breathing and the ambient hum of federal surveillance equipment that made everything feel slightly contaminated. When Franco's voice came through, it was different than she remembered. Or perhaps she was different than when she'd last heard it. Time did that to memories. Reshape them into something the mind could manage. "You're safe," he said, not a question. A confirmation of what he already knew. "I'm alive," Olivia replied carefully, aware that someone was listening on the line, transcribing, analyzing. That's what we said would be the measure of success. The difference between life and safety is significant, Franco said. I've spent considerable time learning the distinction. There was silence between them, the kind that didn't need to be filled with words. Olivia could see him standing in his mansion on the North Shore, looking out at grounds that represented everything she'd escaped from. Could picture the scar on his face, the controlled way he held his shoulders, the dimension of vulnerability he allowed himself only in darkness. I can't contact you again, Franco said. This conversation is already outside acceptable parameters. But I needed you to know something. What? Olivia's voice was barely above a whisper. The 'Ndrangheta has been systematically dismantled over the past 18 months. Not by law enforcement. By someone who understood their operations well enough to eliminate them without creating the kind of collateral damage that would attract federal attention. He paused. The man orchestrating that elimination has certain advantages in intelligence gathering, certain relationships with federal agencies that exist in places that official paperwork doesn't document. Olivia understood what he was telling her. Franco had become the thing that made the system work. Not despite being a criminal, but because he was a criminal who operated by a code that law enforcement could negotiate with. The irony was so complete it was almost absurd. Thank you, she said. For what? For saving your life? For letting you go? For becoming something I never intended to be? Franco's voice carried no judgment, only statement of fact. I did none of those things for gratitude. I did them because I love you. And love, real love, is sometimes demonstrated through absence. Torres cleared her throat somewhere on the line, indicating that the conversation needed to conclude. Olivia had perhaps 30 more seconds before federal protocol overrode everything else. I'll never forget you, Olivia said. You're not meant to forget, Franco replied. You're meant to survive, build something, live in a way that makes my choices meaningful. The line went dead. The surveillance equipment powered down. Torres appeared in Olivia's apartment 3 hours later with a file that she placed on the kitchen table without speaking. Inside was a photograph, Franco's mansion. Exterior shots showing the architectural detail, the landscaping, the way it sat isolated on the North Shore like a statement about power and privacy. Rosa was visible in one photograph, standing near the gate. But Franco was not in any of them. He's disappeared, Torres said without preamble, completely off the grid. We have intelligence suggesting he's operating out of multiple countries, maintaining his organization while funding certain operations that benefit federal interests. You made a deal with him, Olivia realized. We made an arrangement, Torres corrected. He provides information about organizations that are more dangerous than he is. We don't prosecute him for crimes we can't prove anyway. It's pragmatic. It works. Does it work? Olivia asked. Torres considered the question. The 'Ndrangheta is significantly weakened. Several smaller organizations have been dismantled. We've prevented approximately 17 terrorist financing operations. From a purely statistical perspective, the arrangement has prevented more harm than it's caused. Olivia thought about Sean Morrison in prison, about David Price serving his sentence, about James Richardson, who'd ordered her death, now spending years in a federal penitentiary, about Rachel in Chicago, slowly rebuilding a life that had been shattered by her sister's disappearance and resurrection. None of it was clean. None of it was redemptive. But it was real, which meant it was better than the alternative. Rachel visited Colorado Springs in July. It was their first in-person meeting since Olivia had entered witness protection, facilitated by federal agents who maintained a discreet distance. They met in a coffee shop that was carefully selected for its lack of surveillance and its location away from federal oversight. Rachel looked older, or perhaps her sister had simply never noticed how many times stress could layer itself onto a face before it became permanent erosion. He's a criminal, Rachel said without preamble. She had never been one for conversation preliminaries. Yes, Olivia confirmed. And he saved your life. Yes. Rachel stirred her coffee with deliberate slowness. I've been reading about the 'Ndrangheta, about how they've been systematically dismantled over the past 2 years, about how it seems like someone with inside knowledge has been feeding information to federal agencies. Olivia said nothing. She didn't confirm or deny. She simply drank her coffee and let her sister arrive at her own conclusions. You love him, Rachel said finally. I don't know if that's what I feel, Olivia replied carefully. I know that he saved my life when the institution I served tried to take it. I know that he let me go, because keeping me would have compromised who I was trying to become. I know that he's probably going to die in prison or in exile because of the choices he's made, and I know that I'll spend the rest of my life wondering about the roads not taken." Rachel reached across the table and took Olivia's hand. Her grip was tight, anchoring, real. "I'm proud of you," Rachel said. "I hate everything about this situation, but I'm proud of you for surviving it." That night, alone in her Colorado apartment, Olivia accessed a secure server through her work computer. The encryption was Franco's design, something that existed in spaces between legitimate security and criminal paranoia. There was a single message waiting in the inbox. "The restoration project you mentioned before. The one your sister is working on. It's almost complete. She says the subject has become something new. Something with strength you can see in the eyes. Something that survived damage and used that survival as the foundation for something beautiful. I think that's the most honest portrait ever created." Olivia closed the laptop without responding. She didn't need to. Franco would know that she'd read the message. He would know that she understood what he was telling her about Rachel's restoration work. He would know that understanding was enough. Outside, Colorado Springs was transforming into evening. The mountains were beginning to glow with that particular light that only happened in late afternoon, when the sun was angled just right to illuminate everything it had previously hidden. Olivia stood at her window and watched the city shift from day to night, understanding finally that the woman she had been was truly gone. The woman she was becoming was still forming, still learning how to exist in a world that had fractured her and expected her to fit back together seamlessly. She would survive it. She would build something, and somewhere in Chicago, in a mansion on the North Shore, Franco would know that she had. That would have to be how they loved each other now. Through absence, through consequence, through the knowledge that sometimes the only way to save someone was to let them go. The investigative journalist named Marcus Holloway had been chasing the Chicago corruption story for 18 months before he finally had enough pieces to assemble into something resembling truth. His reportage appeared in the Chicago Tribune on a Tuesday in June, a comprehensive piece titled "The Woman Who Survived: How One Detective's Investigation Exposed Systematic Corruption and Changed a City." What Holloway didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know without being part of the federal investigation apparatus, was that the primary evidence came from a criminal enterprise's analysis of police infrastructure. He constructed the narrative around Olivia Wells as the hero of the story, a dedicated officer whose investigation had threatened powerful people and nearly cost her everything. The narrative was compelling because it was partially true. The article triggered a cascade of additional reporting. Other journalists began examining the police department with fresh skepticism. The city council demanded answers. The mayor called for comprehensive reform. By the time the story reached national news outlets, it had mutated into something larger than police corruption. It had become a referendum on institutional failure, on the ways that systems designed to protect citizens instead protected the criminals within their ranks. The Chicago Police Department descended into something resembling organizational chaos. New leadership was brought in from outside the department. Investigation protocols were rewritten. Training procedures were revised. The reform was incomplete and imperfect, implemented by people who fundamentally didn't want to be reformed, but had no alternative when the spotlight became too bright to hide from. Rachel Wells sat in her studio in Pilsen when the Tribune reporter called requesting an interview with Olivia's sister. She declined politely, but thoroughly. She didn't offer commentary on her missing sister's bravery or her own experience with loss. She simply said that the matter was closed and hung up the phone. But she did something else. She sat down in front of the 19th century portrait she'd been restoring for nearly 2 years, and she looked at it with new eyes. The woman in the painting had survived something that should have destroyed her. The artist who'd originally created the work had captured something essential in those eyes. Resilience, determination, the particular strength that only came from being broken and choosing to rebuild anyway. Rachel took photographs of the finished restoration and sent them through the secure channels that connected her to her sister. The accompanying note read, "I finished. I think you'd like what he became." In Colorado Springs, Olivia received the photographs on a Tuesday evening and understood immediately what Rachel was communicating. The portrait showed a woman who'd been damaged, but who'd transformed that damage into something that resembled dignity. It was Rachel's way of saying that she understood, that she had processed the grief of losing a sister who was alive but unreachable, that she had built something from that grief. Olivia worked in cybersecurity for a firm that specialized in corporate data protection. Her job was to identify vulnerabilities in systems before criminals could exploit them. The work was satisfying in a way that police work had never been, because it operated without the moral ambiguity that came with serving an institution that could betray you. In September, 15 months after leaving Franco's mansion, Olivia intercepted a communication during work that made her stop breathing. It was encrypted beyond her company's standard protocols, routed through channels that suggested someone familiar with federal surveillance techniques. The message had been flagged in her monitoring system as a potential security threat, but she recognized the signature of the encryption immediately. Franco. The message wasn't addressed to her. It was directed toward an agent at the FBI, Torres specifically, regarding an operation against the Ndrangheta, intelligence about shipment routes, financial information that exposed money laundering operations, contacts and relationships that would eventually lead to the dismantling of an organization that had terrorized Chicago for decades. Franco was still operating in the shadows, still shaping outcomes that benefited institutions that officially opposed him. He existed in a space between law and chaos, neither fully criminal nor fully complicit with legitimate authority. He was the kind of power that democracies required but couldn't acknowledge, the necessary violence that prevented worse violence from taking root. Olivia closed her laptop and stared at her reflection in the darkened screen. The woman looking back at her was someone new, not the detective who'd been shot in a Chicago alley, not the prisoner in Franco's mansion. Someone constructed from the pieces of both, integrated into something that resembled purpose. She thought about Franco in whatever location he now inhabited, probably monitoring communications that proved she was alive, understanding her world the way she was learning to understand his. They would never contact each other directly. Federal law prohibited it, but they would always know, through encrypted channels and intercepted communications and the simple fact of her survival. They would always know that the other had mattered. That night, Olivia received a news alert on her phone. A joint federal and local operation had arrested 16 members of the Ndrangheta in the Chicago area. Charges included money laundering, drug trafficking, and conspiracy to commit murder. The operation was described as the result of months of federal investigation and intelligence gathering from multiple sources. No one mentioned Franco. No one acknowledged that a Mafia boss on the North Shore had orchestrated the entire revelation through careful coordination with federal agencies that needed his information more than they needed his prosecution. The truth existed in spaces where official records didn't venture. Rachel called that night, her voice steady but emotional. "Did you see the news?" "Yes," Olivia said. "That was him, wasn't it? Your Mafia boss." "Yes," Olivia confirmed, not bothering with denial. "He's still protecting you," Rachel said. "Cleaning up the world so you can exist in it safely. He's protecting himself," Olivia corrected. "The Ndrangheta was a threat to his operations. This serves his interests as much as mine." "Maybe," Rachel said. "Or maybe love is just finding someone whose interests align with yours enough that you're willing to destroy your enemies for them." Olivia didn't respond. She didn't know how to articulate what she felt for Franco anymore. It wasn't romance in the conventional sense. It was something more fundamental and more complicated. It was the knowledge that someone had saved her life, and then had let her go completely, asking nothing in return except that she survive. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I think I need to stop thinking about him. I think that's the only way I survive this." "Then stop," Rachel said gently, "but know that he won't. He'll keep carrying it. That's probably the punishment he deserves." That autumn, as Colorado Springs transitioned into winter, Olivia began the process of building a life that was entirely separate from her past. She joined a book club. She volunteered at a local nonprofit that helped at-risk youth. She developed friendships with people who knew her as Sarah Mitchell, a cybersecurity analyst with no particular history worth examining. And once a month, at precisely the same time, she received a single encrypted message that said only, "Still alive." No signature. No request for response. Just confirmation that Franco knew she was surviving. That somewhere in the criminal underworld he inhabited, he was aware of her continued existence, and that awareness mattered to him. She never responded. She couldn't. But she always read the messages, and she always understood what he was communicating through those two words. That he loved her. That he was sorry. That this was the only way they could ever truly be together. separated by law and circumstance, and the fundamental incompatibility of their worlds. Months would pass without contact. Then another message would arrive, proof of persistence, proof that some connections transcended distance and law and the attempt to forget, proof that Franco Ravellini, criminal and protector, continued to exist in the spaces between institutions, ensuring that the woman he loved remained safe in a life he had built for her and then relinquished. And in Chicago, in a mansion on the North Shore, Franco stood at windows overlooking grounds that represented everything Olivia had escaped from. He waited for messages that never came. He read reports about her continued survival. He organized operations against the 'Ndrangheta and other organizations that threatened the delicate balance he maintained. He lived with the knowledge that he had made the only choice that mattered. He had let her go.